Out at sea, distance lies. What looks like empty water is often watched. What feels like freedom is usually controlled. And what seems like a harmless flyby can quietly become an international incident. This story begins with a foreign military pilot who believed he was testing boundaries. What he didn't understand was whose boundaries he was testing, and how fast regret can arrive when rules of engagement are invisible but absolute. The most dangerous place to provoke. The open ocean feels lawless to outsiders. No borders painted on the water, no fences, no warning signs. But to the U.S. Navy, the sea is one of the most tightly monitored environments on Earth. Every vessel has a purpose. Every movement is logged. Every approach is evaluated. And harassment at sea is not treated as curiosity. It's treated as intent. The aircraft that shouldn't have been there. The incident began when U.S. Navy vessels operating in international waters detected a foreign military aircraft entering their operational area. This was not a civilian plane, not a lost aircraft, not a distress situation. This was a trained military pilot flying a combat-capable aircraft, and he knew exactly where he was. The first pass, just observation. At first, the aircraft stayed at distance, high altitude, wide circle, predictable track. This is common. Military forces observe each other constantly. Observation is legal, expected, routine. U.S. crews noted the aircraft, classified it, and continued operations. No alarms, no reaction, yet. The second pass, the line blurs. Then the aircraft descended. Closer, lower, faster. The flight path tightened. This was no longer passive observation. This was probing behavior. At sea, probing tests reaction time, discipline, and readiness. And the U.S. Navy does not fail those tests. Why low passes are never harmless. To civilians, a low flyby looks dramatic. To sailors, it's a data-gathering maneuver. Low-altitude passes allow a pilot to measure radar response, test electronic warfare systems, gauge crew reaction, identify deck operations. That's why they're taken seriously, because what looks like intimidation can also be pre-attack reconnaissance. The moment it became harassment, the third pass crossed the line. The aircraft flew directly over U.S. vessels, close enough to disrupt operations, create safety hazards, violate established maritime conduct agreements. At this point, U.S. commanders stopped assuming curiosity. They began assuming intent. And intent changes everything. The silent response. Most people never see. Here's what the public rarely understands. The most dangerous military responses are not loud. They are quiet. No radio shouting. No visible panic. No dramatic maneuvers. Instead, sensors focus. Systems shift modes. Decision authority tightens. Defensive options quietly activate. The foreign pilot never heard this, but he was already being measured. Rules of engagement. Not emotion, but law. U.S. forces do not respond emotionally. They respond within rules of engagement, ROE. ROE define what constitutes a threat. When escalation is authorized, how force is applied proportionally. Harassment alone doesn't justify action, but unsafe behavior does. And this pilot was approaching that threshold rapidly. The warning that wasn't loud, contrary to popular belief. Warnings are often subtle. No flares, no gunfire, no chase. Instead, course adjustments by U.S. vessels. Tactical spacing changes. Defensive posture shifts. These are signals professionals recognize instantly. Signals that say, "We see you, we are ready. Do not come closer." The pilot either didn't recognize them or chose to ignore them. The critical mistake. The pilot made a decision that changed the tone of the encounter. He turned back, not to leave, but to approach again, closer than before. This is where harassment becomes risk, and risk invites consequences. Why this story matters? Because this incident was not about ego. It was about misunderstanding deterrence. The pilot believed distance bucks safety, international waters, freedom, U.S. restraint mark weakness. All three assumptions were wrong. When the foreign pilot turned back for another close approach, the encounter crossed a psychological threshold, not because of anger, not because of pride, but because patterns matter. At sea, intent is rarely declared, it is inferred, and inference is built from behavior. How intent is actually determined, U.S. naval commanders do not guess intent from a single move. They evaluate behavioral sequences, repeated close approaches, altitude changes toward ships, speed increases near vessels, overflight of decks or sensor masts, ignoring professional distance. Each of these actions is logged, timed, and compared against known threat profiles. By the third close pass, the pattern was no longer ambiguous. This was not accidental proximity. It was deliberate pressure. What the pilot couldn't see from the cockpit, the pilot saw ships. From the ships, commanders saw everything. Modern naval groups operate with layered awareness. Surface radar, air search radar, electronic surveillance, optical tracking, shared tactical networks. The aircraft's speed, altitude, turn rate, and approach vector were being plotted in real time. The pilot was not just flying near the ships. He was being profiled. The shift from monitoring to protection. Up to this point, the posture was observational. That changed quietly. Without announcements or visible signals, U.S. vessels transitioned into a protective posture. This doesn't mean weapons were fired. It doesn't even mean weapons were targeted. It means authority changed. Defensive options were authorized. Response timelines shortened. Decision thresholds lowered, in simple terms. The room for interpretation narrowed. Why row or design this way? Rules of engagement exist to prevent escalation, not invite it. But they also prevent hesitation. Once unsafe behavior is established, commanders are empowered to act before a mistake becomes irreversible. This is critical at sea, because at jet speeds, seconds erase options. The professional signals. The pilot missed military professionals communicate without words. The U.S. Navy sent signals that experienced aviators recognize instantly. Adjusted ship formations, altered course to reduce overflight risk, increased spacing between vessels, coordinated sensor focus. These are not random. They are deliberate indicators that say, you are no longer being tolerated. A trained pilot would recognize this. Either this pilot didn't, or he believed the ships would still back down. Why international waters is misunderstood. Here's a common myth. International waters mean anything goes. That's false. International waters mean no national ownership, not no rules. Professional conduct agreements govern safe separation, predictable flight paths, avoidance of hazardous maneuvers. Violating these isn't illegal curiosity. It's unsafe military conduct, and unsafe conduct invites defensive action. The moment regret became inevitable. As the aircraft descended again, this time closer and faster, commanders reached a conclusion. This behavior could no longer be allowed to continue, not because of hostility, but because continued passes increased the chance of collision, misinterpretation, accidental escalation. At this moment, the foreign pilot lost control of the situation. He just didn't know it yet. What escalation really means. Escalation is not immediate force. It's capability alignment. Systems don't fire, they prepare. Timelines shrink. Response authority widens. Error tolerance disappears. At this stage, even a minor mistake by the pilot could trigger a chain reaction he could not stop. That's the danger of harassment. It hands initiative to the defender. Why regret comes late at sea from the cockpit? The pilot likely still felt in control. Speed, altitude, maneuverability. What he couldn't feel was decision authority shifting away from him. That's why regret at sea often arrives late, because by the time you realize the situation has changed, it already has. Up to this moment, the foreign pilot believed the encounter was still interactive. He flew. The ships reacted. He adjusted. From the cockpit, it likely felt like a game of proximity and presence, an exercise in confidence. But at sea, control doesn't belong to the loudest maneuver. It belongs to who decides what happens next. And in this encounter, that decision had already moved, quietly, away from the pilot. The invisible line that was just crossed. There is a point in every maritime air interaction where commanders stop asking, "What is he doing?" and start asking, "What do we do if this continues?" That transition had now occurred. This doesn't mean hostility was assumed. It means risk had exceeded tolerance. From this moment forward, the goal was no longer observation. It was containment. How control is asserted without force. Popular culture imagines control as aggression. Real military control looks like constraint. Without dramatic motion, U.S. commanders coordinated. Airspace management around the ships. Sensor prioritization on the aircraft. Communication alignment across vessels. Defensive readiness synchronized as one. The key outcome. The aircraft's freedom of maneuver was being reduced. Not physically, but decisively. The pilot could still fly. He just couldn't dictate the encounter anymore. The signal. Every military pilot recognizes something changed that experienced aviators feel instantly, even if no words are exchanged. The response rhythm tightened. The ship stopped reacting and started anticipating. That shift is unmistakable to professionals. It says, "We are no longer responding to you. We are setting boundaries. And boundaries at sea are not suggestions." Why no radio challenge was needed. Many expect a shouted warning or radio call, but radio challenges are used when identification is unclear, intent is ambiguous, de-escalation is still the primary goal. Here, intent was already inferred. Adding radio communication risked misinterpretation, language confusion, public escalation. Silence was the stronger message, because silence communicates certainty. The pilot's sudden realization. At some point during this phase, the pilot likely noticed something unsettling. The ships were no longer adjusting because of him. They were adjusting around him. That distinction matters. It means his presence was accounted for. His actions were predicted. His influence was neutralized. This is when confidence begins to erode, not from fear, but from understanding. The mistake of assuming restraint equals passivity. One of the most common miscalculations in military encounters is this: if they haven't acted yet, they won't. That assumption is dangerous. Restraint is not hesitation, it is discipline. And discipline forces act only when the outcome is controlled. By the time restraint ends, the result is already decided. Why this was the moment of regret. Regret doesn't arrive when danger is loud. It arrives when danger becomes inevitable. For the first time, the pilot likely understood. He could not escalate further. He could not force a reaction on his terms. He could not guarantee how the next mistake would be interpreted. From here on, even routine maneuvers carried amplified risk. And pilots hate uncertainty they don't control. The quiet exit that saved face. What followed was not dramatic. No chase, no flare, no confrontation. The aircraft turned away, not abruptly, not in panic, but deliberately. That decision was the smartest one made that day, because it ended the encounter while it was still reversible. Why this story is often misunderstood from the outside. It might look like nothing happened. From the inside, something very important happened. A boundary was tested. The boundary held. and the test ended. That's how deterrence is supposed to work. By the time the foreign pilot turned away, the encounter was already being studied. Not for drama, not for blame, but for meaning. Because incidents like this don't happen randomly. They happen where strategy, psychology, and signaling overlap. The real purpose of harassment flights, close approaches at sea, are rarely about intimidation alone. They are used to signal presence, test reactions, collect procedural intelligence, measure discipline under pressure. From the pilot's perspective, the goal is often simple. See how far I can go before they react. From the Navy's perspective, the goal is different. Ensure he never gets that far. That mismatch defines these encounters. Why naval groups are common targets. Carrier strike groups and surface action groups represent concentrated capability. They are valuable to observe because they integrate air, surface, and subsurface defenses. They rely on coordinated command and control. Their procedures reveal readiness. Foreign pilots are sometimes tasked, formally or informally, to take a look. The problem begins when observation becomes unsafe proximity. The signaling game. Most people don't see military signaling as subtle by design. Loud signals escalate. Quiet signals deter. In this encounter, the U.S. Navy signaled awareness without alarm, readiness without threat, boundaries without provocation. That combination communicates confidence, and confidence is the most effective deterrent. How misreading signals creates danger. The most dangerous part of signaling games is misinterpretation. A pilot might misread restraint as unpreparedness, political limitation, fear of escalation. In reality, restraint often means rules are being followed precisely. Decision authority is centralized. Outcomes are being shaped deliberately. When pilots push past restraint, they risk discovering where discipline ends. Why these incidents rarely make headlines. Most encounters end quietly. No shots fired, no formal protests, no dramatic footage. That's intentional. Public escalation increases political pressure and reduces flexibility. Quiet resolution preserves. Diplomatic space. Professional relationships. De-escalation pathways. From a strategic standpoint, silence is success. The thin line between unsafe and unacceptable. There is a critical distinction in military conduct. Unsafe behavior increases risk. Unacceptable behavior demands response. The foreign pilot crossed into unsafe territory. He approached unacceptable territory, but stopped short. That distinction is why the encounter ended without consequence. But it was closer than many realize. What both sides learn from encounters like this, the foreign side learns. Where tolerance ends. How responses are sequenced. What behaviors change posture. The U.S. Navy learns. How its signals are interpreted. Whether deterrence remains credible. Where communication gaps exist. These are not games. They are calibrations. Why regret arrives late for pilots. Pilots experience the encounter physically. Commanders experience it strategically. That difference matters. By the time a pilot senses regret, commanders have already assessed intent, adjusted posture, prepared responses. The pilot feels the shift last when options feel narrower. The professional code that prevented escalation. Despite the tension, professionalism held. No reckless chase, no aggressive radio calls, no ego-driven maneuvers. That professionalism exists on both sides of most encounters. And it's why incidents don't become incidents. It's also why the pilot's decision to disengage mattered. Why this story is a warning, not a victory. This story isn't about humiliation. It's about miscalculation avoided. Because had one more pass occurred, had one maneuver gone slightly wrong, had one sensor reading been misinterpreted, The outcome could have changed dramatically. At sea, margins are thin. When the foreign pilot finally turned away, the incident did not end. It simply left the ocean and entered the system. Because in modern military operations, the real consequences of an encounter don't happen in the air. They happen after, in reports, briefings, and revised procedures most people never see. This final segment is about that invisible aftermath. What happened immediately after disengagement? Once the aircraft departed the area, U.S. naval commanders did three things, quietly and methodically. Logged the encounter in detail, preserved sensor data and timelines, forwarded assessments up the chain. No press release, no confrontation, no escalation, because silence keeps options open, and professionalism at sea is measured by what you don't advertise. How these incidents are analyzed internally. Encounters like this are dissected frame by frame. Analysts examine approach angles, altitude changes, pass frequency, time spent within unsafe distances, response timing by ships. The goal is not blame. The goal is calibration. To answer questions like, did our signals register? Did posture shift at the right moment? Was escalation avoided without conceding space? In this case, the answer was yes. The quiet adjustments that follow. No public rule change is announced after incidents like this. Instead, small but meaningful refinements occur. Updated guidance on unsafe approach thresholds, refined response timelines, enhanced coordination drills, reinforced professional conduct standards. These changes don't look dramatic, but they tighten margins where margins matter most. What the foreign side likely took away on the other side, the lesson was equally clear. The pilot learned. Close proximity does not equal leverage. Restraint does not equal weakness. Decision authority does not sit in the cockpit alone. That knowledge travels quickly inside military organizations. One pilot's experience becomes institutional memory. Why these incidents keep happening anyway? If the lessons are clear, why do these encounters continue? Because strategic signaling never stops. Great powers test boundaries not to provoke war, but to measure resolve, assess readiness, calibrate risk tolerance. The danger lies not in testing, but in misreading the response. That's where accidents happen. The role of discipline in preventing disaster. What prevented escalation in this incident was not technology. It was discipline. Discipline to hold fire, follow rules precisely, resist ego-driven responses, end the encounter without theatrics. That discipline exists on both sides more often than people realize, and when it holds, history stays quiet. Why? Instant regret is often misunderstood. From the outside, people imagine regret as fear. In reality, regret in military encounters is clarity. The moment a pilot understands, the situation is no longer flexible. Authority has shifted. Risk now outweighs message. That realization arrives suddenly, and it usually ends the encounter. What this story actually warns us about this story isn't about a pilot being humbled. It's about how thin the line is between professional signaling, unsafe conduct, irreversible escalation. At sea and in the air, small misjudgments carry strategic weight, and restraint, when misunderstood, can invite exactly what it's meant to prevent. The final truth. The foreign pilot didn't regret approaching U.S. boats. He regretted approaching them one pass too far, because deterrence doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself quietly when options begin to disappear.